There are people who never miss a deadline, never let a ball drop, never allow a crisis to spiral without quietly, efficiently containing it. They are the ones who figure it out. Always. Not because they were born with some extraordinary gift, not because it comes easily to them, but because somewhere along the way, they learned, deeply, wordlessly, that if they didn't handle it, it simply wouldn't get handled. And for a long time, that felt like competence. It felt like strength. It felt like the thing that made them valuable, reliable, worthy of being in the room. But here's what almost no one names. There is a cost to being this person. A quiet, accumulating, invisible cost that doesn't show up on any invoice. It shows up in the body, in the exhaustion that never quite lifts, in the loneliness that sits underneath every accomplishment, in the strange grief of realizing that you have spent years being indispensable to everyone and entirely alone with yourself. That cost is what this conversation is about. Because let's be clear about what this isn't. This isn't about people who are controlling or who secretly enjoy being the hero. It isn't about martyrs who complain loudly about doing everything themselves. This is about the quiet ones, the ones who handle everything and say almost nothing about it. The ones who have learned, somewhere between early life and now, that needing others is a luxury they couldn't quite afford. This is about the specific exhaustion of being someone the world depends on, while no one quite sees how much it costs you to keep showing up that way. There are people who carry the weight of entire systems, families, workplaces, friendships, inside a body that is quietly running on fumes. And from the outside, they look completely fine. That invisibility, the gap between how capable you appear and how depleted you actually feel, is perhaps the loneliest place a person can live. Not visible loneliness, not the kind anyone notices or asks about. The kind that hides behind a full calendar and a reputation for having it together. If you've spent years wondering why you feel so tired beneath everything you've built, this channel is a quiet space for exactly that kind of question. You don't have to perform okayness here. You're welcome to stay. Let's go one layer deeper, because the psychology of this is more interesting and more important than it first appears. People who handle everything alone aren't simply organized or disciplined. They didn't arrive at this pattern by accident. In most cases, this pattern was learned. And like most learned patterns, it made perfect sense at the time it was formed. Think about what it means to be a child, or even a young adult, in an environment where the adults are emotionally unavailable, where the support system is inconsistent, overwhelmed, or simply absent. The child doesn't sit down and consciously decide, I will become self-sufficient. That's not how it works. What happens is quieter, more cellular. The child reaches out for comfort, for reassurance, for help, and the response is uncertain. Maybe it comes with conditions. Maybe it comes too late. Maybe it doesn't come at all. And the child learns, not with words, with the nervous system. If I want this to be okay, I have to make it okay myself. That adaptation is not weakness. That adaptation is extraordinary intelligence applied to a difficult situation. But here's what no one tells you. The adaptation doesn't disappear when the difficult situation does. It becomes the operating system. It becomes the way you move through every room, every relationship, every challenge, for decades after the original wound has healed. You stop noticing it's there. You just call it your personality. Carl Jung spent much of his life illuminating what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we bury, not out of laziness, but out of survival. He believed that the most powerful forces shaping adult behavior are often the ones we never consciously chose, the ones that formed in darkness, beneath awareness, when we were simply trying to make it through. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For someone who handles everything alone, the unconscious pattern is this: I cannot trust that someone will show up for me, so I must show up for everything myself. You don't experience this as a belief. You experience it as just the way things are. You don't think I don't trust others. You think it's just easier if I do it. It feels like preference. It feels like efficiency. But beneath it, often, is something far older, a younger version of you who learned not to wait for the rescue that wasn't coming. I remember sitting at a table once, a long dinner with people I cared about, and someone across the table was going through something difficult. A job loss, a broken relationship. I don't remember exactly what. What I remember is watching everyone at the table lean in, offer words, offer comfort, offer their presence. And I felt, underneath my own words of support, a kind of quiet ache. Not envy, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something more like recognition. I couldn't remember the last time I had been the person at the table who was struggling and had allowed anyone to see it fully. I couldn't remember the last time I had let the weight show. Not because I wasn't struggling, but because somewhere along the way, I had learned to arrive already assembled, to present the version of myself that had handled it, that had figured it out. The dinner ended. I drove home, and I sat in the car for a while before going inside. This wasn't a performance I was putting on, I thought. This was a wall I had forgotten I built. Here's what's important to understand. The person who handles everything alone is not broken. They are not fundamentally different from others in some pathological way. They are, in many cases, some of the most capable, perceptive, emotionally intelligent people in any room. Jung was fascinated by what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a whole self, integrating the parts of us that have been hidden, reclaiming what we buried in order to survive. And one of the things he noticed again and again was this: our greatest adaptive skills often carry a shadow cost. The person who became brilliantly self-sufficient as a child grew into an adult who finds it genuinely difficult to receive, to ask, to lean, to let someone else hold something for a while, not because they don't want connection, but because the architecture of their inner world was built, brick by brick, around the assumption that they would always be the one doing the holding. That is not a character flaw. That is an adaptation that served an important purpose, and that may now be costing more than it's giving. But here's the part almost no one talks about. The cost isn't just personal. It ripples outward. When you handle everything alone, you don't just exhaust yourself. You quietly communicate to the people around you that you don't need them, that you're fine, that there is no room really for them to contribute anything of weight to your life. And so relationships stay at a certain depth. People care about you, genuinely, but they don't quite know how to reach you, because you never give them the opening. You arrive already solved. The loneliness that follows isn't random. It's architectural. It's built into the structure of how you've learned to move through the world. And the cruelest part? You can't fully blame anyone else for it, because from the outside, you look like you have everything under control. Let's make some distinctions here, because this is where things can get quietly confusing. There is a difference between competence and compulsion. Competence is the capacity to handle difficult things well, to show up, assess, and act cleanly. Compulsion is the inability to let others handle anything, even when they could, even when they want to, even when letting them would cost you nothing. Competence feels like a choice. Compulsion feels like a weight you can't put down. There is a difference between independence and isolation. Independence is choosing to act from your own values, without needing constant approval or direction. Isolation is the structural removal of yourself from any meaningful support, not because you don't need it, but because needing it feels too dangerous. And there is a difference between handling things and carrying things. Handling means completing, moving through, setting down when it's done. Carrying means never quite setting down, even after the task is finished, even after the crisis has passed, even in the moments when nothing is wrong. Most people who do everything alone are not simply handling, they are carrying. And they have been carrying for so long that they no longer notice the weight is there, until the body makes it impossible to ignore. Ask yourself, honestly, without judgment, which one feels more true for you. Not the answer you'd give someone else, the one that shows up at 2 a.m. when everything is quiet. This is where most people completely misunderstand what's happening. From the outside, someone who always handles things looks strong, reliable, self-contained, and they are, in a real sense. But beneath that strength is often a very specific kind of grief. The grief of never having had the full experience of being truly, unconditionally held. Not helped, as in given practical assistance. Not managed, not fixed, held, as in allowed to fall apart and still be safe. Allowed to not know the answer. Allowed to be in the middle of something without already having a plan. Allowed just once to be the person at the table who is still figuring it out. Rilke, the poet and philosopher who understood perhaps better than anyone what it means to live deeply inside one's own interior world, wrote something I return to often. In his letters to a young poet, he offered this: be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. For someone who handles everything alone, this is a radical invitation, because the very thing they have spent their life doing is resolving, closing loops, eliminating uncertainty, making sure things are okay before anyone else has to worry about them. The idea of sitting inside an open question without rushing to solve it can feel almost unbearable. But Rilke is pointing at something important. The questions you've been too busy managing to ask. Why do I feel so alone in my competence? What am I afraid will happen if I let someone else carry something? What would it actually feel like to receive? Those questions are not problems to be solved before dinner. They are perhaps the most important questions of your adult life. And then comes the part that changes everything. There will be a moment, and perhaps you've already lived it, where the strategy stops working. Maybe it's a health scare that forces you to depend on others. Maybe it's a loss so big that you genuinely cannot handle it alone, no matter how capable you are. Maybe it's just a Tuesday afternoon where you realize, sitting in a quiet room, that you are exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't touch. Anna spent 30 years being the person her entire family called in a crisis. Aging parents, a sibling in financial difficulty, a marriage that required enormous emotional labor. She handled all of it, efficiently, quietly, without complaint. And then one morning, she couldn't get out of bed. Not literally sick, not dramatically broken, just empty. She lay there and felt, for the first time with full clarity, that she had nothing left to give to anyone, including herself. She described it later as the most confusing relief I've ever felt, because part of her finally understood this wasn't sustainable. This had never been sustainable. She had simply been too competent to notice how long she'd been running on empty. The breakdown wasn't a failure. It was information, arriving the only way it knew how, after years of being ignored. Here is the reframe that matters. Handling everything alone is not a sign that you don't need anyone. It's a sign that you never learned or never felt safe enough to let the need be visible. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. Not needing anyone is a fantasy, a story the most capable people tell themselves to make sense of a life that has required extraordinary self-reliance. Never feeling safe enough to need anyone, that is a real thing, a historically understandable thing, and crucially, a thing that can change. This is the hidden cost made fully visible. Not that you are too strong for connection, but that the very strength you developed made connection harder to reach, and made you harder to reach for the people who genuinely wanted to. It's not a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that you adapted brilliantly to something that was genuinely hard, and that the adaptation has outlived the original problem. So, if you recognize yourself in any of this, if something in this conversation has landed somewhere specific and real, here is what the beginning of a different way might look like. Not a revolution, not a dramatic dismantling of who you are, but gentle, honest adjustments, small openings in a wall that has been there a very long time. It might mean noticing, just once this week, when you take something on that you could have asked for help with, and asking the question, without judgment, is this because I'm genuinely the best person for this, or because asking feels too uncomfortable? It might mean practicing the language of need in very small doses, Not grand vulnerability, not a confession. Something simple. I'm finding this harder than I expected. I could use some help thinking through this. The words themselves are a kind of exercise, and like any exercise, they become less foreign with repetition. It might mean examining the story you tell about why you handle things alone. Most people who do this have a narrative. I'm just more capable. It's more efficient. Other people won't do it right. Some of that may be true. But underneath it, is there also a belief that asking is weakness? That needing something makes you a burden? That the people who should have been there weren't, and you learned not to wait? It might mean allowing someone, just occasionally, to see the unfinished version, not the handled version, not the solved version, the version that is still inside the question. And it might mean sitting with what Rilke offered, to love the questions, to live inside the uncertainty without immediately reaching for resolution. Because the part of you that has always handled everything, that part is not going anywhere. You are not dismantling your strength. You are simply making a little room beside it. Imagine this. Imagine a version of your life where your competence is still fully intact. Your ability to handle things, to figure things out, to move through difficulty with clarity and focus. That doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't need to. But imagine that alongside that competence, there is also a small, honest space. A space where you occasionally let someone see that you are tired. Where you occasionally let someone contribute something that matters. Where the weight is not always, entirely, only yours. Imagine what it might feel like. Not as weakness, but as relief. The specific relief of not being the only one in the room who is holding everything together. That is not a loss of self. That is an expansion of it. You have spent years, perhaps decades, demonstrating that you can handle whatever comes. The world knows this about you. More importantly, you know this about yourself. The question that remains is a different one. Not can you handle it alone? You've answered that 1,000 times. The question is, do you want to? For the rest of your life, do you want to keep arriving already assembled, already solved, already fine? Or is there something else you're quietly ready for? But here's the question that comes next, and it's worth sitting with carefully. Because there's a difference between learning to receive and losing the clarity that your solitude has given you. There's a difference between opening to connection and dissolving into it. Some people who handle everything alone have built, inside that self-reliance, something genuinely valuable. A relationship with themselves that is rare. A quality of inner life that most people never develop. How do you open without losing that? How do you let someone in without giving the whole interior away? That navigation between the independence that has shaped you and the connection your life may now be ready for is a different kind of conversation, one that unfolds in the next quiet space we share. Alone together. A quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.